By this point, I'm sure you've seen all those videos that show off all the cool one-shotting builds in either Elden Ring or some of the Dark Souls games. But in this video, I'm going to answer the question, why? Why is it so impressive? Well, the short answer to that is, well, no, it isn't. I mean, it is, but not in the same way that you might think it is. Let me explain. Before we answer whether or not one-shotting bosses in games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring is impressive, we have to analyze the common experience of the typical person who may play these games. First, we start a new game. Second, we have no idea what we're doing or where we're going. Third, we don't know what enemies we should avoid and come back later to fight. Fourth, we don't even know if we can come back and fight the enemy later. Fifth, we definitely don't know how to fight any of the bosses that we encounter. And lastly, this ultimately means that none of us are ever one-shotting bosses when we play any of these games for the first time. It just isn't possible. This is where the games in the From Software pantheon have made a name for themselves. Have you ever wondered why there are so many articles, social media posts, and buzzwords thrown out about how similar games are to Dark Souls? Phrases like, "This is the Dark Souls of JRPGs," or "Such and such is the new Dark Souls" get thrown around so much. Even the term Souls-like has become ubiquitous in gaming culture to the point that even Steam has it as a tag whenever you shop for games on their platform. But what does Souls-like even mean? With Dark Souls being over a decade old by now, it can be very difficult to see at first glance how the game has influenced the medium of video games. But all you have to do is look a little deeper. For example, Dark Souls really does not have a tutorial. I mean, it does technically, but it just consists of telling you what buttons to press for certain actions to take place. And if you don't figure out how to use those actions to your advantage, you just die. And you have to start over again. Another example is how Dark Souls really doesn't tell you where to go. But don't get me wrong, by no means is this at all native to Dark Souls. Games have technically been doing this since the first Final Fantasy, probably even earlier. But in recent history, no other game really treated you like Dark Souls did. Dark Souls really just lets you roam around. You don't have a log to tell you where you're supposed to be going. You don't have some beacon in the sky that says where you're supposed to follow. And you don't have a linear hallway that shuttles you in the right direction. Sure, you can do other things to find your way through the world, like talk with NPCs, read item descriptions, and find other lore clues, but these features are absolutely not the norm in video games. The choice to call upon the player to pay attention to detail, to give them the choice to interact with NPCs for more important information, and to even punish them when they don't really pay that much attention is insane. The fact that all of us who have played Souls games can relate to figuring out that you need to light the windmill on fire to eliminate the poison in Mytha, or that you can use the Storm Ruler to help immensely while fighting Yorm, or that the Serpent Hunter is supposed to be used to fight Rykard is, in all seriousness, beautiful. It doesn't matter if you found these things out by yourself, if you found a guide on the internet, or even if a friend told you. These small revelations that From Software sprinkles into their games really do connect each and every one of us who has beaten From Software titles. We share a common experience, we understand what we've had to go through to beat these games, and we can relate to each other. I can go on and on about how Dark Souls has revolutionized gaming. Like how, on death, you lose literally all of your money and experience points if you just don't retrieve them from the previous time that you died. Or how you can summon other players into your world to either help you or to challenge you. But let's get back to the topic of the video. Is one-shotting bosses impressive? At first you would probably say that it is. I mean, if I saw someone one-shotting bosses in Dark Souls after I'd spent hours, if not days of my first playthrough trying to beat a boss, then yeah, I would be impressed. However, the more you play Dark Souls, the more you play Bloodborne, the more you play Elden Ring, the more you realize that the more damage that you deal means the easier the game is going to be. And this is where we begin to realize something. Maybe dealing less damage should be considered more of an impressive feat than dealing more damage. I don't know about you, but 10 years ago, side note, but oh my god, it's been a decade since I've started playing Souls games. I really do not know where the time has gone. Anyway, back in 2013, after finishing my first playthrough of Dark Souls, I was proud of myself. I had beaten what was then one of the hardest games I've ever played, and I didn't give up on what sometimes seemed like an impossible task. But then, I started hearing about people beating the game on level 1, which absolutely blew my mind. This not only meant that you were limited on your damage output, but it also meant that you couldn't level up health, you couldn't get more stamina, you couldn't equip heavier armor, you couldn't wield certain weapons, and you couldn't use most of the spells in the game. It was truly mind-boggling. However, if you fast forward to the release of Elden Ring, we can see that this has kind of become the norm. More and more people feel the need to challenge themselves in these games because of what it means to do so. You could argue that with the additions of items that increase your stats, that the level 1 challenge has been made slightly easier, but the idea still stands. Playing through Elden Ring at level 1 seems like an unbearable challenge to someone who has just beaten the game for the very first time. On the flip side, dealing more damage starts to just seem like more of a feat of understanding the game. All you really need to do is search on YouTube for the best build that suits your fancy, and you can have a much easier time in the game compared to your first playthrough. So, I go back to the original question again. Is one-shotting bosses in games like Elden Ring and Dark Souls impressive? Well, after analyzing how dealing less damage makes the game way more difficult, we can say that in terms of gameplay, and gameplay alone, one-shotting bosses isn't really that impressive at all. However, that doesn't mean that problem-solving involved in figuring out how to one-shot bosses isn't impressive in its own right. Again, we look back on our first playthroughs of the Soulsborne games. We remember just how difficult it was to squeeze out just a bit more damage before moving on to the next boss. We farmed for runes and souls for hours, trying to be able to get just the minimum stats to wield a new weapon. And then we needed to farm even more to upgrade the weapon and to deal more damage with that weapon. The fact that someone could seemingly bypass all of that hardship and organize a build that could take care of a boss in just the press of a button seems insane. And if we look deeper into how people make one-shot builds, we can see that there's quite a bit of work put into preparing a build designed to one-shot all the bosses. For one, not all bosses have the same amount of health. Obviously, you won't need as much damage to kill Margit as you do with bosses later down the line in Elden Ring. Additionally, some bosses are more resistant to one type of damage than another boss may be, which means that a weapon or a spell used to one-shot one boss might not be able to be used on the next boss. Another hurdle is that not everything is readily available to you at the beginning of the game. This means, well, you just have to work with what you got. You aren't going to be able to just use anything in the game to help you one-shot the first few bosses you encounter. So your problem-solving skills and a bit of your creativity are going to be put to the test. Sure, you're going to have to spend a lot of time setting up and going to places that you would otherwise not go to so early in a normal playthrough, but much of the game will still be locked behind one or more bosses that you will have to figure out how to one-shot. So, to answer the question one last time, is it impressive to one-shot bosses in games like Dark Souls and Elden Ring? Yes, of course it is. And if you don't think it is very impressive, then hey, that's alright too. At the very least, when you watch videos that feature these one-shot kills, you have to admit that there is a feeling of catharsis that you get from seeing a boss that took you hours to beat just be killed by a click of a button. It is, for some reason, entertaining.